I'm Kelly Nagle. Today I talk with the award-winning attorney and industry leader, Jeremy Evans. Jeremy is the founder and managing attorney at California Sports Lawyer, where he represents entertainment, media, and sports clientele. Our conversation takes many twists and turns on its way towards understanding the interconnectedness of law, sports, and society. Jeremy and I discuss misconceptions about the First Amendment and athletes' rights. Then we veer into Hollywood to uncover the differences in responses to actors engaging in social justice initiatives versus athletes. And we also get a bit philosophical, examining how sports represents some of society's most revered ideals like equity, fairness, and competition. But despite the complexity of the topics at hand and the twists and turns of the conversation, I'm happy to say that we navigated our way towards an optimistic outlook. Here's our conversation. Enjoy.
As far as the First Amendment goes, I think there's a lot of misinformation or misunderstanding about what really has to occur there. But the First Amendment on the United States Constitution, you have to have a government actor. You have to have a government actor, and specifically, it's all depending on what type of speech we're talking about. If you're talking about a public forum, standing on the street corner, it's the highest form of protected speech. And the government has to have what they call a compelling state interest to get involved or to restrict that speech. Very high standard. And this has all been interpreted by the U.S. Supreme Court and courts over the years. So you have to have a government actor. So what is a government actor? Well, generally, it's just a government entity, the police or anything like that. Usually taxpayer dollars are being used. But even state schools have been considered government actors because they receive federal dollars in certain contexts, particularly with regard to like Title IX and stuff. But for example, using Colin Kaepernick as an example, here's a guy who decided to kneel during the national anthem. Nobody stopped him from doing it, but he did lose his job. And so the question then became, people were asking, well, what about his First Amendment rights? Well, he doesn't have any. In the private context, you have to have a government actor. The NFL is not a government actor. San Francisco 49ers are a private entity, so clearly there's not the connection there. And so it's not a public forum. This is a private field, private stadium, the whole thing. Arguably, I guess you could say that maybe the Levi Stadium in Santa Clara is a partial government place because it's, involved in the, investment of that facility, but it is not a public entity as the law would define it. And again, he was not held from protesting. It was just, then the question then became, well, was it an antitrust issue and collusion? And as it turns out, they ended up settling that. But then the question becomes, generally sports have an antitrust exemption because you can imagine that what it might look like if you had to apply maybe private or the best way to say this, if you had to apply principles that apply to normal businesses to the NFL or the NBA or Major League Baseball, it would make it much more difficult to run those leagues effectively for the public in the sense of public viewing. Because if the NFL didn't have a monopoly, so to speak, on football, and I guess maybe you could argue it might be better, but you might have 15 different leagues pop up and go, okay, like we now know, now we're the professional football league, You can argue that all day long. I mean, I think in some sense, on a political spectrum, you probably could get a lot of conservatives and a lot of people on the left that might agree with sports being more of a controlled environment, but I don't know. I mean, that's probably a topic for another time. But George Wills, who was like, I remember watching this, what was it? The 9 Innings of Baseball by Ken Burns, that documentary. And he's a conservative columnist for all these years. And he says in this documentary, he goes, I'm a conservative, but in the context of sports, I'm very, very left because I want a controlled environment for sports. I want to be able to enjoy it for what it is and not have outside influences or whatever. But anyway, so I guess to answer your question succinctly and not give you the professor answer, would just be that there really is no free speech in sports in that way. Teams basically allow it, and either because they support it or they don't want the backlash. But either way, there is no free speech infringement when you're talking about a private entity without a government actor involved.
Mm. to know, because I think there is a misconception that people can say whatever they want and there is no regulation, but you're signing on to be a part of a private entity, and there are policies and procedures that, and I might be dumbing this down too much, so please correct me, but if you're opting to be a part of that, then you opt to abide by the rules. And I equate it to when I was running a nonprofit, we revised our employee handbook and put in different policies. And it was, we did it under with legal guidance, but the organization decided what the policies were, and the employees had to abide by those. I take from what you're saying, it's the same thing. The leagues are a business, and players are opting to be a part of it, and you need to abide by, what goes and what doesn't. And if they say you can't do these sorts of, speeches or movements or gestures, then there's not a free speech argument to be made. But I do like your professor hat, because this is based in an educational institution, about the antitrust, because that's a different layer as well, and a very interesting dynamic that I guess worked against Colin Kaepernick and the other individuals who joined him in kneeling and protesting the brutality of law enforcement against the Black community. That even though he settled, he's still without a job, and some of the other individuals as well. So I think it's another layer to a very complex issue that you bring in to light, that you are dealing with these massive structures that have some exemption in the business world that we all indulge in.
Right. Yeah, no, and you said it perfectly. Look, I mean, at the end of the day, if you join a country club, you got to follow the rules. When consumers look at an athlete, they look up to their talent. And I actually wrote a very interesting piece about this. It's basically what makes a great athlete. And the 5 things I came up with were, number 1 was leadership and humility. Number 2 was skill and performance. Number 3 was effort and competitiveness. Number 4 was community involvement and family. And number 5 was recognition, post-career accolades, and business interest. And I think that sort of what makes an athlete go from great to legend, great to like immortality, so to speak, the Michael Jordans versus the Clyde Drexlers, not to, make fun of Clyde Drexler, or the Michael Jordans versus, name any other player, the Tom Brady's versus the Drew Breeses as a recent example, right? I mean, that's kind of a bad way to do it, because I think Breeze is a really good guy off the field too, but it's being able to kind of connect with your fans as a great sort of athlete, but then also be able to do it like in a context of helping people and giving back and truly being known as a good person. And I think that goes a long way. And I think your point earlier about a bandwidth is important. When you're talking about certain athletes being able to do certain things, I would imagine there's probably even certain actors that can do that too. Although at least right now I can think of fewer examples. I mean, just in my mind, maybe it's just because it's closer in proximity, but when I think of, not that actors and actresses aren't involved in charities and things like this, but it just seems like most professional athletes, for example, Lee Steinberg, as a part of, Famous Agent, part of his sort of plan with every athlete he has is, what's your talent? What's your charity? What's your community? What's your personality? And I think if they hit all 3 of those, he'll take you on as a client. But I think you mentioned it earlier. I think bandwidth is really important. And I think something that scouts might refer to as character. It's the funny example I can think of is the movie Moneyball with played with Brad Pitt as Billy Beane, I guess executive vice president of Oakland Athletics now. And there's sort of great line and experience where he goes into the scouts room with the scouts, and the one scout's like, we can't get this guy. He's got an ugly girlfriend. And it's like, what does that have to do with it? And he's like, well, it means he's got still low self-confidence, or whatever these things that came up. But in a joking way, it highlighted both the analytics aspect of, looking at the numbers and understanding that, but then also looking at what's this guy's personality. And obviously that seemed it in a joking way, but I think there's something, for example, if we were to be scouting Tom Brady, I remember, and I love Tom Brady. I'm a big fan of his. I think he's a great athlete, and I love watching him. And I think it's a treasure every time we get to watch him. But it's funny. I could have sort of looked back at, not saying that I would have drafted him. I don't know. I wasn't in that context. But I remember watching him at Michigan. And it wasn't that I was looking out for him or I heard of his name. I remember I was just flipping through the channels, and I remember coming across that game and seeing his tenacity to come back a couple times in several of the games that he played. And I said, man, like this guy, like he's got some talent, And then, of course, because of those circumstances, he wasn't drafted as high and didn't have all the accolades. I think there was like 6 or 8 quarterbacks drafted before him. And then I remember when he got brought into the game after Bledsoe got injured, and he comes in and he ends up taking the team to the Super Bowl. I remember the time when he came into the game, so I think back in 2000, 2001, I think it was 2000. Mm-hmm. And I remember thinking to myself, well, this is the same guy that, made all those comebacks. Like, why can't he do that here? And of course, exactly what he did. But so again, I think those intangibles are important, and scouts and player executives will talk about that ability to connect with people beyond the field, I think is important. And people do it in a right way that people can consume, right? Like the greatest example I can think of is like the dispute between, and the differences between, like, let's say a Malcolm X and a Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was a guy out there sort of preaching love and civil disobedience. And he had this great sort of line where he talked about, when looking at issues in life, he went through a 4-step process. And he said, the first is you must gather the facts. The second is you have a negotiation with the other side. The third is you have self-purification, when you get rid of the things in your life that are causing problems or disarray, or where you're not loving your brother or your sister. And then the fourth is direct action, right? And I think, unfortunately, a lot of times in this day and age, we have especially with social media and everything being so immediate, that we have the tendency to sort of just jump into things and go, all right, let's do this. Whereas I think Dr. King would have done it a different way.
I'd like to thank Jeremy for joining me today. And if you'd like to see what he's up to, you can follow him at Jeremy M. Evans ESQ on Twitter and Instagram, or visit his website at csllegal.com. I'd also like to thank all those who made this podcast possible: our wonderful production team, the George Melton Group, Winnie the Mood for our theme song, and my Teen Think Tank Project co-founder, Matthew DeSantis. Most importantly, I'd like to thank you, the listener. Let us know you're listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. You can follow the podcast on Twitter and Instagram at problem_pod. For more information on today's topic, or to find out more about social justice programming for exceptional teens, please visit the Teen Think Tank Project at teen_think tank. Until next week, I'm Kelly Nagle.